Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm trying now to record a brief lecture before you go for the tutorial using the WebEx recording feature. So let me now share the content. Give me a minute. All right, so the focus of my recording for today is on the period of British colonization. And we are looking into we would like now to try and analyze the both the positive and negative effects that came as a result of British colonization. All right, so let's recap the various colonial periods that we have in the history of Malaya. Uh, Started with the conquest of Malacca by the Portuguese. So that was in 1511. And the Portuguese ruled Malacca and the regions and territories that fell under the protection or within the territories of Malacca for a period of about 130 years, from 1511 until 1641. In 1641, the Portuguese were defeated by the Dutch, and the Dutch ruled the areas of Malacca and a few other territories around that area between 1641 until 1824. Now, I had discussed the details about uh, in relation in relation to the points mentioned or stated in the slide on the Q letters, the British and Dutch Treaty. So you can refer back to my previous recording for further information about that. Now, what we know officially when it comes to sole administration by the British in this part of the world, in Peninsular Malaya in particular, that started in 1824 and that went on until World War II in 1941. So between 1941 until 1945, World War II affected Southeast Asia, and Malaya was also affected. So that was the period of Japanese occupation. The Japanese were the allies of the Nazi Germans. So because of that, they went on a massive conquest of various territories in Southeast Asia, and Malaya was included. The British came back after the Japanese were defeated in World War II, so they ruled and took over or continued with the colonization of Peninsula Malaya from 1945 at the end of World War II until we finally gained independence in 1957. All right, so let's recap again on some information that we have covered in the last class. Penang was the first territory, the Penang Island, the first territory that fell under British rule, and this was something that is often credited to this man, Francis Light, who managed to weave or you know play himself into the position where he eventually managed to gain um, control of the Penang Island from the Kedah Malay Sultanate. Again, the details of that I've explained in the previous lecture. Now, the other significant event in terms of a territory that was conquered or took over by the British was the island of Singapore. So Singapore came under the influence or the control of uh, of the British in 1819, and the man that is often credited for this is Sir Thomas Stamford Raffles, right? Now, again, some of the details of this I've explained in the previous lecture. You can refer to that later on. So this is a significant diagram. Why? Because as I explained previously also, the countries that we know today in Southeast Asia, Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, historically speaking, we were more or less people of the same culture, the same background, the same skin color, the same complexion. However, we became people of different countries. Why? Because the Western European powers, or in the case of Philippines, the Americans later on, came here and they conquered various territories, and they divided the territories amongst them. So what eventually happened in 1824, the British and the Dutch signed an agreement to divide the territories in the Malay archipelago amongst them. So the areas that you now see colored in this diagram, colored in red, that was these were the territories given to the British, and the territories that you see colored in blue given to the Dutch. Yellow at that time was under the Spanish. Eventually, the yellow territories, which is now the Republic of Philippines, were passed by from the Spanish to the Americans. However, Malaysia, as you know today, our territories were exactly the result of the agreement that was signed between the Dutch and the British in 1824, as you can see the result from this particular diagram. So the issue now is we want to look into the question of what kind of masters were the British. Now, again, I often like to be as fair as possible, as objective as possible when we discuss about this. Even though I'm a Malay, I'm a Malaysian. We are very. I am just like anyone who studied Malaysian history in national schools over here in Malaysia. We are exposed to a certain type of narrative when we talk about the British colonization period. Uh, More, I would say, focus on the negative side. However, to be fair, let's try and be fair. There are many good things also that the British did, but at the same time, in saying so, we need to try and analyze both sides of the argument. Now, this particular photo that I put over here, this is you can see the description in this particular slide. Tok Janggut's body was then carried across Kelantan River. So this is a man who was known by his nickname Tok Janggut. Literally, is actually translated as Grandpa with a beard. So, as you would imagine, this man is an slightly older man. So that's why it's called Grandpa or Tok. Why he was called Grandpa with a beard? Then obviously, you can imagine that he was someone who was wearing a beard. Now, he was someone who led a group of local rebellious groups of people to go against the British in the state of Kelantan in the early 20th century. So, to cut the story short, he eventually was defeated. His group was defeated by the British. So, as a sign of triumph on the part of the British, they actually did this. They hung his body upside down. Now, the reason why they did this was to scare off other local people from trying to do something similar, which is to rebel against the British. So this was, in a way, a tactic or a show of intimidation on the part of the British, trying to scare off any other possible attempt of a rebellious movement against the British at that particular time. So there are a few others rebellious movements that occurred throughout the time when the British ruled Malaya. Um, some of them were because of the issue of land titles. Before the British came, there was no land titles or law with regards to land ownership. So if there is a vacant land anywhere, you can go there and plant something and build your house. But when the British came, they introduced taxation, land ownership. So that results into a lot of disagreement, unhappiness on the part of the previous landlords, so people who used to assume that this land belongs to them. So when the British asked or said that you have to fill up a form, pay uh, taxes for working in this land, if you want to uh, develop it or use it for agriculture, you have to pay other things. So obviously you can imagine the local people were not very happy. So on that part, it's actually both good and bad. The good thing about having the law that was introduced by the British about land and agriculture, it makes things a bit more systematic. So you know this land belongs to whom and it's for what purpose. And also, funny enough, it actually gives a chance for people in the lower rung in the society, people who are not part of the royal family or the noble people, to acquire land for them to build their own houses, to work on the land for agriculture and others. But those who were really unhappy about this new arrangement were obviously the previous landlords, people who were part of the ruling class before, who now have to work under or operate under the rules introduced by the British. Now, during the period of British colonization, economic development did occur, definitely. But if you want to be negative about this, as I explained before, the British did this not necessarily to develop the people here or develop the country that they have colonized. They just basically develop it for them to maximize or extract as much wealth as possible for themselves. So rubber, tin mining, these were the two main industries that really grew in such massive scale during this particular time around the 19th century up until the first half of the 20th century. So Malaysia until today, in fact, is one of the biggest producers of rubber. Tin mining is no longer something big because tin, right? You can Google what tin is. It's no longer a very valuable commodity. So because of that, it's no longer cost effective for people to continue with the operations. Now the British obviously built a lot of infrastructure, houses, transportation services, trains, trail racks, um, buildings and modern irrigation and sanitation and things like that. But again, if you want to look into the negative side of this, they were doing this merely to serve the needs of the British officers who were staying here. So it wasn't really the case that they wanted to build all these facilities for the benefit of the local people, because that was just simply not the case. Only, of course, if you're really, really rich, the local people who are really rich, who are really part of the ruling class of the royal family, only they were the ones who could afford perhaps building houses from bricks, and also installing like modern sanitation, irrigation, water supply, electricity, and so on. Now, the other very controversial issue with regards to the negative effect of British colonization, looking at it from a certain angle, was the influx of migrant workers. Now, the local people over here in Malaya were predominantly Malay, people who are like me or my ancestors, who are Malay speaking and Muslims. But when the British came, when they really wanted to develop the rubber industry and tin mining industry, they did not have enough people amongst the local to work as laborers. And the Malay people also did not or refused to work with the British, but that's another story. So the British had to find ways to find cheap laborers, to bring in cheap laborers to work in these new industries that are being rapidly or that were rapidly being developed. So they brought in workers from India, from the Indian subcontinent, and also from mainland China. So that's the origin of the large number of Chinese and Indian people that we find over here in Malaysia until today. So the issue that has often been discussed with regards to the influx of migrant workers is that the British realized that for them to remain in power, they could not have the local people and the migrant workers uh, coming together, be united, and fight against them. So, because of that, it is to their interest that these people should be divided or separated as much as possible. So that was the allegation that people often make about the British. The British allowed or simply um, uh, continued with the arrangement where the Malays were staying in the villages and they were farmers and fishermen, traditional workers. The Chinese were brought in. One primary reason was to work in tin mining. So the Chinese settlements or Chinese communities were there in large numbers, in large group nearby tin mining sites. And the Chinese were also involved in a lot of the businesses that occurred or that started in urban areas. So because of that, there are a lot of Chinese people in city areas, and that is something you can see until today. The Indians, on the other hand, were brought in as workers in the rubber estates and palm oil estates. So that is another area where a different group of society or community was staying. So the Malays, Chinese, and Indians, they were not necessarily interacting, and that was something that people felt, or some historians felt, was something done on purpose by the British, so that these people do not come together and fight against the British. And that is a situation that happens or continue to has an effect until today, because the Malays, Chinese, and Indians, at times when discussing about politics and things in relation to that, there is some level of suspicion uh, against each other. The Malays felt that, always feel that the Chinese perhaps wants to take over the country, wants to control the economy. And the Chinese, on the other hand, they are majority of the non-Muslim. They felt that the Malays wanted to convert them or force them to become Muslims, force them to forget about their Chinese culture and embrace the Malay culture. So that level of suspicion is always there even until today. And right, some people like to say it's because the British who started this. But then, of course, right, it's something for all of you to think about. Now, the extent of large influx of migrant workers from both India and China resulted into the imbalance that you see over here. You see the Malays in 1891 were the majority in urban areas, but by 1931, in a period of about 40 years, they have already become the not they have not they are no longer the majority group. The Chinese, in fact, the size of the community in urban areas had grown massively, and as a result that they have become the dominant group in urban areas. So when you gain control of the urban areas, it means you are also in control of the economy. So that is something even until today the Malay people felt the Chinese are controlling it. They do not want to share the wealth of the commercial industry over here in Malaysia. And that kind of suspicion it remains even until now. Every time during elections, you find such argument being carried out by different parties, especially those who are in the um, those who are very nationalistic, very Malay-centered in terms of their political ideology. Now, on the bright side, or on the positive side, what the British did was they introduced formal education. I think this was the point I had emphasized yesterday or in previous lecture as well. Um, they built school, right? The British did, right? This is the first school that was built by the British, called the Free School in Penang. Why free? Because really it's free, right? When you study over there, you don't need to pay. But it's just that back then, this was in the early 18 the early 19th century, around 1821, around that, uh, there was very there was a great lack of awareness, right, in terms of the importance of education, which is why many parents did not consider it to be important or necessary for them to send their kids to school. So that's why the number of people in schools at that time was not very high. But as eventually things changed, right? School became compulsory. The British introduced compulsory education law, and that was something really good because it did uplift uh, the 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 education level of the entire population, that to the extent now over here in Malaysia there is hardly anyone who is illiterate. The only people who are illiterate over here in Malaysia today would be those who still live in the interior regions, the aborigines, right? But even that, also the numbers are getting smaller and smaller. So that's one great success that you can see in this country, and you have to credit the British for starting the process of introducing compulsory education. Now, the other thing that was also introduced by the British that was good was infrastructure, transportation, right? Yes, you can be cynical about this and say they only built this to serve their own people, to transport materials to the port, and then from the port to the ships would carry it back to Britain. Yeah, that was something that was true, something the British did. But the British also expanded the transportation system and network to include to facilitate or provide services for people to travel, right? Commercial passengers to travel from one area to the other to make things much easier. In the past, if you were to travel from the southern region over here in Malaysia to the northern part, could easily take you maybe 1 week, right? But now, right, you can do it with the roads that was built, with the train system that we have, something that was started by the British and of course developed, expanded further by the Malaysian government after independence. So that has resulted into a very nice um, infrastructure that we have that we still enjoy until today. So that is something that should not be taken for granted. Right, so these are other examples of schools that were built by the British. The Victoria Institution is a school that is located in Kuala Lumpur. I believe two former prime ministers came from this particular school. Malay College Kuala Kangsar is another elite school that was built by the British to train future local leaders. It is a boys' school. It is still until today a boys' school, a boarding school. And four of our prime ministers actually came from this particular school. So you can see the British did have at least some good intention when it comes to developing the local people, right? This is one example of a man, Frank Swettenham, who really dedicated his entire adult life working over here in Peninsular Malaya. So he first came to Malaya as a junior officer, but later on rose to the level of the most senior British officer in the British administration of Malaya. And he was someone who was known to be so close to the local people to the point that eventually he knows or he mastered the Malay language. He could also speak some of the Chinese dialects. So you can see that there are not only him, there were a few other British officers as well who were really dedicated in terms of really wanting the country and the people to develop. So that's a positive thing that we ought to consider. So having listened to what I've explained just now, I would like you to go to tutorial 1. um, the link you can find on Open Learning under the topic History and Politics. I will share you the link also at the announcement later on. Please answer the question that is put forward. There's only one question, but it's an essay question, so please write an answer which is not a short one. It should be something that you expand very well, explain with some arguments and some facts, right? Names of schools, perhaps names of uh, certain specific developments that the British did, so that your answer becomes much more, profound and much more extensive. Okay, so thank you very much for listening. Do your best for the tutorial because it is graded, right? So I'll see you guys next week. Right? Have a nice weekend. Thank you very much.